Hello and welcome to the Dual Status Youth and Their Families webinar. My name is Katie Mercier. I'm the Communications Associate at the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. I just wanted to walk everyone through a couple of technical details before I hand the presentation over to our presenters. First, you'll notice that all of the attendees are in listen-only mode. If you have a question, we'll do Q&A at the end, but you can type in your question in the questions box throughout the presentation. Or at the end of the presentation, you can press the raise your hand function, and I can unmute you, and I'll announce you, and you can ask your question. I do suggest that if you're on a cell phone or just not on a landline, to use the questions box so that we can avoid any of our audio feedback issues. And with that, I'd like to introduce our presenters. Jessica Heldman is the Associate Executive Director at the Robert F. Kennedy National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice at the Robert F. Kennedy Children's Action Corps. She has experience in the representation of dependents and delinquents in juvenile court, policy research and development in child welfare and juvenile justice, and impact litigation on behalf of foster children. She has served as a consultant in this work since 2004 for organizations including Children's Rights in New York City, the Child Welfare League of America, RFK Children's Action Corps, and Georgetown University Center for Juvenile Justice Reform. She has assisted numerous state and local jurisdictions in reform efforts, guiding work that includes legal analysis, practice development, and organizational change. Carrie Harp is an independent consultant with the RFK National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice. She has experience in multi-system collaboration, community mobilization, prevention, early childhood education, grant management, and rural communities. Her most recent role was as director of the San Luis Valley Joint Interagency Oversight Group, where she provided leadership and direction to regional youth-serving agencies involved in Colorado's Collaborative Management Program. She worked to implement improvements in the areas of data collection, screening, family involvement, blended and braided funding, systems of care, and institutionalizing mechanisms to support and protect dual-status youth. And with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Jessica.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you to everyone on the webinar for joining us today. We are absolutely sure you have a very busy schedule, so we are very heartened that you would take time out of your day to join us to talk about this subject matter. Our goal today is to share with you some of the key details of our work on behalf of dual status youth. Our hope is that this information may motivate or prompt you to take action in your own jurisdiction and your community on behalf of this challenging but very deserving population of youth. We're going to be covering a great deal of information today, so it will be necessary for us to move quickly, but we really want to emphasize that we are available to follow up after the webinar on any questions you may have that don't get answered today, or to provide any additional information. And you'll see our contact information on the very last slide. So thank you, Katie, for the introduction. My name is Jessica Heldman, and I have had the privilege of working with a team of consultants since about 2004 on systems integration initiatives, particularly focused on improving outcomes for this population, these dual status youth. I came to this work following my time working with both dependent and delinquent youth in court, and prior to that, as an arts educator in both shelters and group care settings. And as a personal note, I came to this work because when I was the arts educator, I taught elementary age foster youth. Then when I was training as an attorney in the juvenile court 5 years later, I found that I was interviewing some of the same youth, now in juvenile hall, now adolescents, the exact same kids that I had been teaching just a few years prior. And these kids were still involved in the in the child welfare system. So it was clear to me that these kids were following a path that was not uncommon amongst their system-involved peers. So since that time, I've been fortunate enough to work with colleagues who share this deep desire to help systems succeed in changing the course for these youth. So among these colleagues is my co-presenter today, Carrie Harp. And Katie introduced Carrie, but I just wanted Carrie to have a moment to say hello and introduce herself.
Thank you, Jessica. Hello, everyone. My name is Carrie Harp, as Jessica pointed out, and I'm delighted to have the chance to speak with you today on behalf of the Robert F. Kennedy National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice. Just to tell you a little bit about me, I am based in Colorado, just south of Denver, and as Katie mentioned, came to the NRC after most recently working for several years as a director of a joint interagency oversight group in southern Colorado. And in that effort, I had the privilege of working with a regional multi-system collaboration that included many partners such as probation, human services, mental health, education, Division of Youth Corrections, including others. And the purpose of our collaboration was to identify ways to more effectively serve the multi-system youth that we all knew were so familiar to each of us. And we dove in and tried to find opportunities to improve the outcomes for these youth, and we're delighted to come across the practices and products that we'll be talking to you today about, because they really added some guidance to what we wanted to focus on. And like many, if not all of you, I just know what it's like to see a youth enter the system and struggle to find their way out, despite all of our best intentions. So for that reason, I'm absolutely passionate about this topic and have a heart to support practitioners and policymakers like yourself as you strive to make this positive difference in the lives of children and youth. So we hope that you will be encouraged and guided by the end of this presentation today. And as Jessica said, any follow-up questions or thoughts, we are here for you if you'd like to follow up with us.
Great, thanks, Carrie. Katie, next slide, please. So Carrie and I are both pleased to be part of this Robert F. Kennedy National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice, which launched this year as a program of the Robert F. Kennedy Children's Action Corps. The Corps itself was founded in 1969 as a living memorial to the late Robert F. Kennedy, and it strives to improve the lives of children and families through care, treatment, education, and advocacy. And the reason we bring this up is really to let you know that we are guided by what is expressed in the quote that you see on your screen, that really the truest measure of whether we live up to our ideals is our youth. We want you to know that through a longstanding partnership with the MacArthur Foundation, the Action Corps has done this work to help jurisdictions better understand the unique needs of youth in the juvenile justice system who have suffered abuse or neglect, and the critical importance of collaborating across these multiple systems of care. Katie, next slide. And most recently, the MacArthur Foundation has moved forward by launching the Resource Center Partnership, which seeks to continue the wave of juvenile justice reform in the United States by helping practitioners, administrators, policymakers all tackle issues that are really central to improving outcomes for kids and communities. And just for a moment, I want to let you know about the resources that are available to you through the Resource Center Partnership, because beyond what we talk about today, there are probably numerous issues that these resource centers could be of assistance to you in. So there are 4 of the resource centers that focus on 4 critical areas. The first is a better response to mental health needs. This is work done by the Mental Health and Juvenile Justice Collaborative for Change. Second is a stronger public defense for indigent youth, and this is the work of the National Juvenile Defender Center. Third is the appropriate interventions for youth charged with status offenses like truancy, running away, curfew violations. This is the work of the Vera Institute's Status Offense Reform Center. And then finally, our center as well. So just so that you're aware, these resource centers exist, and you can find out more about them on the Models for Change website. Next slide, please. So we're going to begin talking about our area of expertise here by looking at a case example of what we call a dual status youth. So this is a real case from a jurisdiction with which we worked, and it really illustrates a typical kind of case that arises and then what this jurisdiction was able to do that was a new and innovative approach based on their work within our framework. So we're going to call this youth PM just to talk about him for a moment. He is a young man who was detained. He was charged excuse me, with assault and battery. He was held on 2 prior occasions on similar charges. He's become extremely aggressive and assaultive in school and in his placement. He has been through every level of care with the Child Welfare Department, including intensive foster care, group homes, residential treatment programs. His aggression continued while he was at the detention center, They hospitalized him for a few days where he stabilized. When he was charged back to the detention unit, his aggressive behavior started once again, and he required frequent restraints and also had assaulted a staff. So given this presentation, while at the detention facility, PM was facing a commitment to the state's Juvenile Justice Agency. Both the Child Welfare Department and the Juvenile Justice Agency knew that a commitment to juvenile justice was not the intervention that he needed, yet that was traditionally what would have occurred. So we're going to talk at the other end of the webinar about what in fact the jurisdiction did in this case. But I'm going to first turn it over to my colleague Carrie to share with us some information about what the research tells us about dual status youth like PM. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Jessica. As we begin the discussion on the connection between involvement in the child welfare system and involvement in the juvenile justice system, it's important to reflect upon the trajectory of this particular relationship. There is indeed a pathway from maltreatment to delinquency, as these data show. A child with a history of abuse or neglect is 59% more likely to be arrested as a juvenile, 28% more likely to be arrested as an adult, and 30% more likely to commit a violent offense. Interestingly, a child who is neglected has almost the same risk of committing a violent offense as a child who has been physically abused. This is particularly concerning to us when we know that the majority of child welfare cases are for neglect, not physical abuse. And it has serious implications for how we support those youth who have been, quote, only neglected, as it can be very tempting to think that they haven't suffered as badly as children who have been physically abused. We also know that children with a history in child welfare are younger at the time of their arrest, are arrested more frequently, and commit nearly twice as many offenses. The earlier arrest data are particularly disturbing because young offenders are much more likely to have their criminal careers characterized by serious, chronic, and violent offenses compared to children who begin committing crimes at a later age. So, in effect, if a youth is going to get arrested, it's our hope that it's when they are older, not younger. All of this being said, the presence of abuse or neglect in a child's life does not necessarily buy them a ticket to prison. Though they do face significant risk factors that other children don't face, their future is not deterministic. What we do know, however, is that some youth who have experienced a series of heightened risk factors, there are particular reasons to be concerned. Next slide, please. We'd like to highlight one particular study out of Missouri today. In this study, the researchers sought to identify the particular developmental pathways leading to juvenile violence. They identified 4 primary risk factor categories, 2 of which we list on this particular slide. The other 2 include a history of juvenile justice involvement and demographic variables. For the point of this webinar, we'd like to simply highlight the mental health and social environment risk factors that connect maltreatment to violent behavior in youth. When a child is abused or neglected, the resulting trauma can produce changes in brain development that affect their mental health. In addition, this trauma can affect their cognitive and social skills and their ability to resist the use of substances. When these factors are combined with other social environmental factors, risk factors such as harsh parental discipline, lack of supervision, and exposure to violence, substance abuse, or parental incarceration, it isn't difficult to imagine a child who has been maltreated acting out in a manner that lands them in the juvenile justice system. When you factor in the additional traumas caused by the displacement of a child from their home and school through a child welfare out-of-home placement, the link becomes even less mysterious. Katie, next slide, please. Thank you. So knowing that there's a connection between being maltreated and committing offenses is one thing, but recognizing how often offenders present in the justice system with histories of maltreatment and or child welfare involvement becomes really imperative for both practitioners and policymakers. One study out of King County, Washington, which began tracking 4,475 court-involved youth in 2006 through a period ending in 2008 is what we'll look at next. During that time, it was identified that 2/3 of these youth offenders had some form of involvement in the child welfare system, either historic or current. Again, when they started tracking them in 2008 and ended in 2006 and ending in 2008, they found over that time 2/3 of the youth offenders had some form of involvement in the child welfare system, historic or current. When controlled for their prior history of offender referrals, that number jumps up. 89% of the youth with 2 or more prior referrals were identified as having some form of child welfare involvement. And while each jurisdiction will have its own prevalence of dually involved youth, we do know both from data collection and anecdotal self-reports that this is a population of youth that is significant enough to warrant some attention. I would imagine many of you are nodding your heads as we go through these data right now because you see it played out in your jurisdictions day after day. So we know the numbers are high, but why are we taking the time to share this webinar with you if we all have an internal recognition that this population is unique and prevalent in the system? And the answer lies in the next slide. Katie, can you advance that for us? Thank you. Research has shown that not only is there a link between maltreatment and delinquency, but there are a number of disturbing trends for these youth once in the system. They are detained at an earlier age, more frequently and for longer periods of time than youth with no child welfare involvement. In addition, we see a correlation between child welfare histories and juvenile justice recidivism. 57% of first-time offenders who had a history in child welfare recidivated within 2 years, while only 30% of youth with no child welfare histories recidivated in 2 years. When the child welfare system is factored out of the equation, and so only one system, there is also a notable difference in future arrest rates. In Los Angeles County, half of the youth who were involved in probation alone with no child welfare involvement had a jail stay in early adulthood. In contrast, 2/3 of the youth with both child welfare and juvenile justice involvement had jail stay in early adulthood. So in other words, system involvement is often the sticky rock rolling down a hill. Exposure to one system often occurs involvement in more systems. And what we should also find pretty sobering are the high costs associated with these youth. If they are being detained more often, earlier, longer, and recidivating more often, this means there are significant placement costs that come with very high price tags. So basically we know that once a youth is involved in both systems, their outcomes are worse, and we see them move deeper and deeper into the systems, all at a great fiscal and human cost. So if anyone asks, why this particular population, we find that pretty easy to answer. And if we can make any change in how we process these kids in our systems, we are improving their chances for success. Next slide, please. So who are these youth and why do we call them dual status? They are known by several different terms, but for the point of our clear communication, we'd like to highlight that we are speaking about youth that has some form of involvement in both the child welfare and juvenile justice systems. The broadest term is dually identified, which simply refers to a youth entering the juvenile justice system with a history of child welfare involvement. Dually involved youth have concurrent involvement in both systems, and dually adjudicated youth are youth who have a concurrent dependency and delinquency case open with the courts as noted in the diagram. And I just wanted to note that this group represents the smallest number of dual status youth. They're in jurisdictions report that anywhere from 5 to 17% of their dual status youth population falls into this category. So at this time, I'm going to hand it back over to Jessica to share a little bit about how the efforts to support this population have developed over the years. Jessica?
Thanks. Next slide, please. So we found the research to be compelling, and we hope you agree. The research really supports what we all know anecdotally, and we hope that some of those statistics, some of those numbers can bolster what might already be an interest you have within your jurisdiction and community for getting the ball rolling on reform. So again, messaging to those around you that dual status youth are in fact a group who are particularly at risk for delinquent and violent behavior, for a myriad of problems in adolescence, adulthood, for deepening and continuing involvement in juvenile and adult criminal systems. If that's the message, we need to follow it up by saying, what in fact do we do about that? So we believe that the coordination and integration of the child serving systems is really the key to turning the tide for these youth. Historically, excuse me, back in 2000, we set out to understand the prevailing issues that impacted the ability of jurisdictions to, in fact, coordinate their efforts on behalf of this population. We convened state and regional symposia to explore these issues, and out of that, we developed a framework that organized a systematic approach for resolution of the key obstacles that were identified. The framework was detailed in our guidebook that was published in 2004. The framework has evolved as more and more jurisdictions have applied it. Most recently, our work in 4 sites through a joint grant from OJJDP and the MacArthur Foundation yielded great case examples and additional materials that we captured and share in the 3rd edition of our guidebook and in our new technical assistance workbook. Both of those are put on your screen there. The workbook provides a much more detailed step-by-step guidance for jurisdictions who are taking on a dual status youth initiative. Next slide, please. So the most recent publications reflect an emphasis on certain subjects, strategies, and activities that really over the past decade plus of this fieldwork have emerged as particularly important. So what you'll find in the newest edition of the guidebook is capture and expansion on these points of emphasis, offering a closer look at how they inform the recommended practices that Carrie will talk about later in the presentation. I'm not going to go over each of the points listed on this slide, but I will mention a few areas that have been of growing significance and have been demonstrated most clearly in our recent Foresight project. One area is the increasing awareness of juvenile justice and child welfare personnel of the need to make trauma-informed assessment and intervention an integral part of their policy and practice. We call this out specifically in the latest version of the guidebook, and we point to the need for all of the child-serving systems to communicate as an essential part of a trauma-informed juvenile justice system. A second area worth mentioning is that more and more jurisdictions are becoming willing to take an honest look at their system's organizational culture and then to take steps to change it. Organizational culture is simply how you describe the way we do things around here. And almost inevitably, culture will have to change in order to bring about change for the youth and families that the systems serve. So we dedicate a whole segment of the guidebook to this topic and the common themes among approaches to organizational culture change. This is certainly an area that gets Carrie and I jazzed, and it's really exciting to work in jurisdictions and see that culture change take hold. An example of the gradual but successful effort to culture change is in Outagamie County, Wisconsin, and we highlight their process in the guidebook. Ultimately, organizational culture can be one of the strongest barriers to forward progress, and transforming it really does require an intentional and a strategic approach. So we attempt to give guidance on that front in our materials and with our technical systems. And finally, I just want to point out the critical work of clearly defining the desired youth outcomes and establishing methods for measuring the effectiveness of efforts to achieve those outcomes. We found that if that is the impetus at the beginning, if we can get together with a group and define exactly what those desired outcomes need to be at the outset of the project, that can guide and direct the entire initiative and really message to folks why the effort is a worthwhile endeavor. So the guidebook provides an example of the work done in Hampton County to that end, and they really were able to identify some detailed outcomes and measures that are going to help them evaluate their progress as a county towards those initial goals that they agreed upon. So these points of emphasis drive our work as we continue to assist jurisdictions in these kinds of initiatives. Next slide, please. Just briefly, we're often asked which jurisdictions have used our framework. You can reference this slide. We have 12 jurisdictions start on this slide that have worked through the complete framework from day one all the way through. There have been others who have used aspects of the framework in technical systems to achieve outcomes related to other target populations, such as in Illinois. The framework was used to address adolescent domestic battery cases. And then there have been a host of other jurisdictions that are not listed that have used the framework without direct site-based technical assistance, and we'll talk more about how that becomes available to jurisdictions near the end. Next slide, please. So what exactly did these jurisdictions who worked through the framework do? So let me walk through this a little bit for you so you have an idea of exactly what this kind of process looks like. The framework presents a process divided into 4 phases that in our experience have guided jurisdictions to successfully initiate, realize, and then most importantly sustain change. Our framework recognizes that each jurisdiction will have its own unique goals in taking on this work. Our goal is to work with each jurisdiction to help define those outcomes that are desired for both the systems and the youth and families that they serve, and to support the development of a workable plan and products to achieve those better outcomes. So you see the 4 phases listed on the slide. The first phase of the work involves mobilization of the relevant and necessary agencies and stakeholders. Through their collective knowledge and support of the work, these folks can provide the expert input needed to move the initiative forward and can solicit the buy-in of the broader community at large. This kind of effort really does take a significant support from the community and from members that maybe have not been brought to the table traditionally to talk about reform. So this mobilization process requires that jurisdictions take a look at the structural foundations that already exist, identify those that need to be developed in order to support collaborative work. We, throughout the years, have heard a lot of jurisdictions that say, yes, we collaborate, but when we really get down to the nuts and bolts of it, a lot of those structures are not in place. And so the collaboration that exists is a kind of ad hoc collaboration that happens between practitioners who tend to be on the same page, but if those practitioners leave their jobs or their positions, the collaboration leaves with them. So we really focus on creating those structures to help institutionalize the changes. Now, phase 2 is an analytic phase, and it goes by the incredibly exciting term study and analysis. That gets everyone very excited, but it really is fundamental to the success and sustainability of this work. The first area of study that's listed in this phase recognizes that a good look at data collection, management, and performance measures is essential as part of this endeavor. Data must be recognized as a foundation for integration and coordination efforts. It tells you what you need to know about the youth in your target population, or in fact, who should be part of that target population. This aspect of study and analysis requires jurisdictions to identify questions to be answered and to determine the data elements for collection to support understanding, planning, as well as the effect and effectiveness of policy and practice. The study and analysis phase then moves on to an exploration of resources and practices in order to address the challenges that we see in many jurisdictions: duplicated efforts and services, contradictory case plans, costly repeated interventions, and lost opportunities to plan for a continuum of service delivery focused on success with long-term outcomes. So we ask jurisdictions to take a hard look at the resources and practices that are currently in place. The analysis phase finally includes the essential exploration of law, policy, and information sharing. This is an opportunity to establish a cross-system understanding of the legal mandates at play among all agencies, how resources are allocated, and best practices in court processing to support integration and coordination efforts. A really important area of focus for many jurisdictions in this area of study and analysis is information sharing. Many jurisdictions have found that previous efforts to work in a coordinated fashion have been thwarted by misunderstandings of the law and what it permits or prohibits in terms of sharing information. Many an effort at collaboration and coordination has come to a screeching halt in the face of what we call the 5-letter words, HIPAA, FERPA, and other related legal acronyms. The framework meets these challenges head-on by asking communities to take a good look at what information needs to be shared and how the sharing can be facilitated between the systems. So after moving on from the fun of study and analysis, we ask jurisdictions to compile the findings and then consider several recommended practices and products that can become part of an action strategy. And a list of these recommended practices are included in our guidebook, and Carrie's going to share more about those shortly. Finally, jurisdictions will move from action strategy to implementation, and this final phase requires jurisdictions to engage in detailed planning to ensure that there is a clarity of purpose, clear assignment of responsibility, an understanding of goals and expected outcomes, a commitment to evaluation, and strong leadership to support and sustain the implementation. So next slide, please. So I'm sure that doesn't sound like too much to do in the course of maybe 12 to 15 months, which is usually the time span. But this is really a process that, with the assistance of the consultants particularly, can drive the development of some new ways of working together that really help to increase efficiencies. So the time spent on the front end really pays off on the back end. So here's a graphic representation of how the process unfolds and leads to the desired outcomes. So when I mention the back end, what I really want to emphasize here is that this is why the framework exists. Jurisdictions take on this work not just because they're looking for something to do, but because they want to improve the outcomes for the youth that they serve. So all of the study, analysis, consideration of recommendations, development of implementation strategies, all of this exists as a method for ultimately achieving better outcomes for these youth. Each jurisdiction creates its own specific desired outcomes, but I do want to point out that we have listed some on the slide as an example of commonly identified outcomes that drive these projects. Note that these outcomes for youth look far beyond the traditional goal of reducing recidivism. Although this is an essential driver of the work, we emphasize that it's just one among a list of areas for improvement that truly focuses on a youth's well-being. So once these outcomes are identified, the development of an evaluation strategy can really help a jurisdiction determine how it will measure success in relation to those outcomes. So in the guidebook, we provide an example of the outcomes designed by one of our sites and point out how they identified data sources that were necessary to access in order to collect the data that they needed to evaluate measures. The sites from our 4-site project are immersed in the process of collecting data this year, in fact, with the expectation that by year's end, there will be an opportunity to evaluate the success of their work in relation to their desired outcomes. We look forward to being able to share that in 2015. I'm going to turn it back over to Carrie, and Katie, if you can advance the slide.
Thank you, Jessica. So if you're anything like me, this is the part in the presentation where I would start to wonder, okay, I get it, we have a problem, and there's a framework to help us walk through a process for improving outcomes, but what are the strategies? What does this actually look like when it's implemented in a community? And the answer to that question, we recommend the following practices for communities to consider. And as Jessica mentioned a few slides back, these practices have been identified and developed over a decade through the work in communities and are based on multiple promising practices and approaches. The first is developing a routine process to identify the dual status youth that you choose as your target population in your own jurisdiction. So going back to duly identified and duly adjudicated, you would pick your own target population, but how are you going to identify that in a routine way, in a verifiable way, each time they hit your particular entry point in the system? If we're going to try to make a difference in their trajectory, we have to find this verifiable way to identify them as soon as possible once they enter the second system. Each jurisdiction has created a unique way to do this, and they often found that it required both attention to their process maps and their information sharing protocols. So both of those are very important pieces to this particular recommendation. The second practice is looking at the youth as an individual with unique needs and therefore creating individualized outcomes for them. And hopefully that's not the first time this whole concept has been shared with you, that we recognize that the creation of individualized outcomes can also occur much easier if the next practice of using validated screening and assessment instruments is implemented. So in addition to the use of these instruments, they also help identify trauma and separate the low-risk offenders from the high-risk offenders. All of these things lead to better outcomes and greater efficiencies to the system. They also lead to making wise decisions about when a youth can and should be allowed to avoid formal processing. So identifying alternatives to formal processing is one other effective practice that we recommend. I would be surprised if this is the first time you've heard the term family engagement, and while it may be tempting to give it lip service, we certainly encourage communities to identify as many points as possible in their process where systems can be engaged. Let's face it, our systems are confusing, even to us sometimes. And often I put myself in the family's position and imagine what it must be like to walk through one of our systems, especially when you're in a crisis situation. I recently came across a quote in a book that said, "Resistance happens when there is a lack of clarity." And that was a light bulb moment for me. There's often a lack of clarity and understanding about our processes for our families, and also sometimes for the people we work with, speaking to organizational change. So it's really important that clarity be given to all steps of the process. And when it comes to families, we have to recognize that this process is not happening necessarily with them, but often to them. So how can we engage them more and bring them into the process so they feel more clear about what's happening to them, and they are feeling like it's happening with them and not necessarily to them. And granted, is engaging families in magical recipes? We wish. It isn't always that way, but will it give us the greatest chance to see positive outcomes? We absolutely believe that it will, and know that it does. And towards that same end goal, we also encourage a joint assessment process across the systems that includes families. And considering ways to coordinate case planning, core processes, and case management ensures that the youth will be seen in a holistic light. It clearly prevents the all too common scenario where the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. This not only provides a better chance for the youth's unique needs to be met, but also creates efficiencies and better outcomes for those multiple systems that are serving the youth at the same time. And lastly, the recommended practice is to increase the focus on family stability, placement stability, and community connections. We know that out-of-home placements are sometimes the answer. There's no question. But we also know that multiple moves are incredibly traumatic. Therefore, jurisdictions are encouraged to prioritize stability and connections to the community. And as I think about what we covered in the last 2 slides, I often visualize the framework as a skeleton. It's the structure that provides a strong foundation for a process that will improve system and youth outcomes. Without an organized process, say the skeleton, if you will, often our best efforts can be all over the place without the structure that's needed to walk us through something that's systematically organized. And when these practices that I just went over are added to the skeleton, they become the muscle and the form that holds it all together. They bring the life and the effectiveness and progress to the work around dual status youth. And we'd like to note that it's not necessary to implement all of these practices. However, we do encourage jurisdictions to give serious consideration to as many as are possible and realistic, because the more you have, the stronger your process will be for handling dual status youth and create a stronger safety net for them and make sure that their entry into the system doesn't leave them worse off than they would be if they hadn't come in the first place. When we begin to work with a jurisdiction, we find that some have many of these practices already in place, while others find that these practices present a completely new way of doing business. So right now, I'm going to ask Katie to pull up a poll. We invite you to take a moment and assess for yourself where your own jurisdiction falls on that spectrum. It will be interesting for all of us, I can speak personally for Jessica and I, to see the general trend among the jurisdictions represented on the webinar today. So including the 3 coordinated case and court options, which are each somewhat unique and distinctive, there are 10 practices listed on this slide. So please take a moment to log your answer, and then Katie will compute the responses. So there will be a period of silence for a while. Okay, hopefully everyone has had a chance to log their answer, and we'll wait for the results. Wow, look at that. That's great. Looks like we have a wide variety, but some definite progress. The majority of your jurisdictions have already implemented some of these practices, which is terrific. That's really great to see. Hopefully what this means is that this will be a helpful webinar for you in your jurisdiction, that you can see some new practices and move those forward, and hopefully use some of the resources to guide you in that process. But that's encouraging. Thank you so much for taking the time to take that poll. Let's keep going. Katie, could you advance the next slide, please? As we move to the next slide, we list the common products that institutionalize these structures and practices to ensure they become routine. So again, we often know what it's like to implement a new initiative and then see it die off. And that is not the goal. We are looking for long-term system change. So these particular products allow jurisdictions to create protocols for how they work with the dual status population. The majority of jurisdictions we have worked with find value in the development of a memorandum of understanding that serves to formalize the commitment of the multiple agencies that have come together who want to coordinate on behalf of this population of youth. In King County, Washington, for example, the original charter agreement drafted in 2003 defined shared goals and responsibilities for its dual status youth initiative, and it provided a foundation for almost a decade of collaborative work. In 2012, the county executed a working agreement to update the scope of work and renew the shared commitment. Another product that sites have found tremendously valuable is the case flow process map that is often developed as part of the practice and resource aspect of the study and analysis phase. So going back to the second of the 4 phases that Jessica went over. Generally, the sites explore the current state of their case flow in the child welfare and juvenile justice systems, and then work together to craft an updated case flow map that reflects the key decision points regarding dual status youth. It also highlights the opportunities for cross-system efforts at these points. This updated case flow map often serves as the basis for the development of new policy and practice, as well as training plans. In fact, we strongly emphasize the need for formal documentation of these new policies and practices, as well as any new training curricula, as essential components to ensure the institutionalization of a new way of doing business on behalf of these youth, to ensure that these changes will continue to go on just by changes in leadership or other efforts that might be introduced into the process. So very briefly, we'd like to provide you with an example of how one of the 4 sites in our most recent technical assistance project pulled all of these pieces together. Next slide, please. Hampton County, Massachusetts chose dually involved youth as their target population. Their specific description was youth who are arraigned on a delinquent offense and are already involved in child welfare. So they have a current child welfare involvement. And they defined it even further to identify current investigation, a voluntary application, an open care and protection case, and in Massachusetts what's known as a child requiring assistance case. If you recall from our definition slide close to the beginning, this group is particularly represented by the middle diagram of the overlapping circles. The outcomes that they were working toward included fewer violations of probation, greater stability of placements, better educational results, increased connections to pro-social activities, and better permanency planning. And the practices they implemented included identification of dually involved youth at arraignment, at that particular point when they come into the system, engagement of families, a coordinated case conference that included youth and family, school personnel, probation officer, the assistant DA, social worker, mental health, and so on. And they identified alternatives to formal processing such as diversion. They also created a dedicated docket and developed a cross-system trauma-informed training. And lastly, they hired a parent advocate to work with the families when they were identified as dual status and walk them through this process. And they also implemented data collection efforts. As Jessica mentioned, this is a significant part of the work, identifying the outcomes and then creating from the outset how they were going to collect data to reach those outcomes. Sometimes that falls off the plate in the discussion, and we at the National Resource Center are very vigilant about having that conversation, even though it can be sometimes challenging and require even more work around the information sharing and so on. But in the end, it all leads to you being able to say, this is where we were headed, this is how we tracked it, and this is how we know that we are making a true difference in the lives of youth and in our system outcomes. So to guide Hampton in making these practices routine, they developed an MOU focused on information sharing, multiple caseflow process maps that help each system understand the other systems, and a dual status youth implementation manual. Next slide, please. So let's take a moment to circle back and check on PM. As a result of Hampton County's diligent efforts to systematically incorporate these practices into their handling of dual status youth, PM's story had an ending that may otherwise not have happened. Both the Child Welfare Department and the Juvenile Justice Department knew that PM's presentation was not just behavioral, and that a commitment to a juvenile justice facility was not the intervention he needed. At a cross-system team meeting, there was discussion of a possible referral to an intensive residential treatment program, with a focus for PM to stabilize and then transition back to a Child Welfare Department program. And at the time, they were not sure if this was even possible, given that he was not a committed youth and wasn't in a hospital setting. And the reason we share that is, instead of just pulling from the list of tools and practices that they were familiar with, they brainstormed and then researched, is this even possible? Well, through the collaboration, the Juvenile Justice Agency was able to get approval from their central office to complete a forensic evaluation. And that resulted in PM being approved and placed in an intensive residential treatment program setting. PM successfully completed his treatment at that program and then stepped back down into a Child Welfare Department campus residential program. PM did extremely well there, and after a year he stepped down into an independent living program where he remains today. He is now 19 years old and is doing extremely well at the program and is working on his independent living skills. He has graduated from high school and is now attending college while being employed at the same time. While there is no guarantee that any intervention, whether on an individual or system level, will produce a guaranteed outcome, we can confidently recognize that due to the early identification of PM as dually involved, and because of the effective case conference, PM's needs became individualized. He was not seen just through the eyes of his delinquency, and as a result of his service plan, was tailored to successfully meet his unique challenges. So our goal as a National Resource Center is that every dual status youth would have the opportunity to end their story as successfully as PM's. And because you're listening to this webinar, it's probably safe to assume you know your own PM and want to do everything possible to give him or her a fighting chance to leave the system better off than they came in. And we passionately share that same goal. At this time, I'm going to turn it back to Jessica to share more about the Dual Status Youth Initiative through the efforts of the RFK National Resource Center. Jessica.
Thanks, Carrie. I'm just going to take a couple minutes to wrap up and ensure that we have time to cover any of your questions. As I noted at the beginning of the webinar, this is a lot of information, and we've covered it quite quickly. The next slide, please, Katie. What the next slide here points out are what we can do to support your exploration of potential efforts and initiatives, or just even questions about this population in general, and then be able to offer potential support ongoing for any efforts that you want to undertake. So let me just point out a few here. Well, let me make note also that some of our listeners today may be part of a SAG, and we want to note that in that capacity, what you can do is really work to identify that this population is a priority concern in the state plans. As we pointed out through the research, this is a group that incurs significant costs and experiences some significantly troublesome outcomes. So we really do push to identify this group as a population that requires some investment of resources, time, and innovative thinking. In addition, you can create RFPs to those organizations and agencies that are eligible for grants for technical assistance, so we can support work in various communities. So that's one aspect of what you can do to move forward. You can also visit the website for our Resource Center or contact us to find out more about our technical assistance and consultation. We love to come on site and work with jurisdictions using the framework, the tools, and the resources that we described today. I really want to emphasize, though, that the technical assistance and consultation approach is really intentionally and carefully designed to avoid prescriptive measures assigned to state and local jurisdictions. We do not endorse a rigid course for change at all. Our approach provides these ideas, these resources and tools and guidance that can add value to efforts to bring about long-term sustainable improvements. But we're really flexible in crafting technical assistance to meet the needs and to respect the capacity and resource limitations of jurisdictions. Beyond what we do on site, we also provide the publications that are housed on our website. All the publications are available free of charge. Again, although we want to work with you on site, we want to provide complete access to our materials to any jurisdiction that wants to explore using them on their own. And I just want to make particular note of the information sharing toolkit. As we noted previously, information sharing can be a particular challenge in these kinds of initiatives. So we worked with the Juvenile Law Center to develop this toolkit, which can be particularly helpful in busting through some of those barriers. And then we also are happy to provide presentations, training to help communities or constituencies better understand these youth. And we have a very unique practice network that brings together professionals in the field who have taken on this dual status youth work. They are working together to create new innovations, to highlight advances in reform, and they're happy to serve as a peer network for professionals. Any of you who would want to discuss challenges and opportunities in reform and discuss that with folks who've done the work on the ground. Next slide, last slide. We are so glad you took the time to join us today. Hopefully you learned something new about this population of youth. We look forward to following up with you if there are any areas of interest or questions or concerns. So we have just a few minutes to discuss any of those now while we're together today. So I'll turn it back over to Katie to open it up for questions.
Great, thanks so much. So while everyone has a chance, you can type in your questions into the questions box, or you can use the raise your hand function, and I'll unmute you and announce you. Just as I said, if you're on a cell phone, I really suggest typing in your question to avoid any audio feedback. So while I give people a chance to do that, I just wanted to remind everyone that we have been recording this webinar, and we will post the recording and the PowerPoint presentation up on the C2J website within 24 hours. So our first question for our presenters is, what screenings are you using for trauma?
So when we work with a jurisdiction, we don't come in with necessarily a requirement that any screening tool be used. What we do is we have the jurisdiction take a look at what they use, if anything, and if not, we help them explore the possibilities. We have a wonderful partnership with Tom Grisso and Gina Vincent from NISAP, National, I'm going to forget the exact title, National Youth Screening and Assessment Project, got it. And they have done incredible work around the development of assessments and screens, and so we partner with them sometimes on site to help the jurisdiction delve into discussion about what would be the most appropriate tools for use in their own jurisdiction.
Thanks. Our next question is, how do we know that utilizing this framework will lead to improved outcomes?
Well, that's a very good question. Really, our framework was designed to address each of the major barriers and obstacles that may undercut the ability of a jurisdiction to be successful in creating and enhancing a routine approach to the benefit of every dual status youth and their family. So what it really does is it promotes evidence-based practices for use at each of the key decision points impacting the dual status youth population. Because the framework promotes the need for collaborative multi-system leadership, coordinated case planning, reliance on validated structured decision-making tools, and coordinated case management, we really assert that the framework provides the best opportunity for each jurisdiction to craft those evidence-based solutions that are viable for routine application within their systems. So really, this is a recipe for providing the structures that are going to lead to those improved outcomes. And really, the research supports the evidence-based practices being the best approach for this. And if we can provide greater access to those services, to those programs, we are very confident that that is going to allow for improved outcomes for the youth. Can we answer your question that this framework is going to allow you to identify those improved outcomes in every single case? No. But we can argue that implementing the framework really enhances the likelihood that these youth outcomes will improve. And we absolutely can point out particular jurisdictions where this has happened. And we are committed to developing the data that is going to help grow that body of evidence.
Katie, before we go on to the next question, this is Carrie. I just wanted to circle back to the first question about the screening, and I just wanted to put out there that as part of the work of the National Resource Center, Jessica mentioned the practice networks that we have pulled together and our partnerships with organizations like NISAP and Gina and Tom. And I would encourage people to check back on our website regularly, because through these partnerships and the practice networks, we have discussed with practitioners and reformers in the field, what do you want to know about next? What kind of guidance do communities really need when they tackle these types of issues? So in working with these experts, they are creating articles, and we'll be putting white papers and innovation briefs specifically to be very relevant and applicable to the work in the communities. So we're not talking theoretical, hypothetical conversations and papers, but really the practical advice on what these communities need to enhance their work around particular topics. So just want to let you know that that's the work of the National Resource Center, and those various publications and articles and so on will be posted regularly on our website.
Our next question is, what success have you had in rural areas which lack many basic community resources?
That's another great question. I think that in rural areas that we have worked with, something that has been a real plus for us is that usually with a what tends to be a smaller target population and then smaller departments in and of themselves has allowed for a lot of rapid change early in the process in terms of that culture change, establishing practices for collaboration. If we can get folks who are on board with this type of change, usually the messaging that needs to take place, the training that needs to take place, the oversight for things like development of new agreements or protocols tend to move a little bit faster. And we do find that that allows us to spend a bit more time talking about how we can increase or develop the kind of resources that may be lacking or maybe harder to access. And then if we can point towards some of the initial savings that can occur because of the increased efficiencies, sometimes that can allow us to really brainstorm on how those fiscal resources can then be applied towards the development of services that folks have really targeted as being essential to working with these youth. So that's been our experience.
Okay, our next question is, how does one ensure that youth are not pushed further into the delinquency system as a mechanism to access placement or service resources?
That is often an initial conversation and truly an ongoing conversation that we have with jurisdictions. There's a lot of concern about net widening, and really the focus is about this early identification and bringing folks together at the earliest point so that we really can talk about diversion. We really can talk about alternatives to formal processing. We find in the research that we know there is a foster youth bias in the system, in the juvenile courts in general, so that when youth come in front of the juvenile court, it's more likely that they are in fact going to be adjudicated delinquent and become part of the juvenile justice system. So that's why we back up and really go upstream, and we start to talk about these youth at the moment that they are identified, be it through law enforcement, the school, probation, the juvenile court. That's when we want to convene folks together to talk about what are some alternate strategies for ensuring that this youth doesn't come further down the line into juvenile justice. So that really is a great question that undergirds so much of the purpose of the work that we do.
Okay, our next question is, who would you identify as a model jurisdiction with regard to dual status youth improvement?
Oh, let's see. There's been so much good work that's occurred. I think I would consistently point to King County, Washington, and Los Angeles County as really the standard bearers for other jurisdictions to mimic. King County has a wealth of experience having been engaged in this work for a decade, not necessarily with us at every point, but we started out with them and we've continued to support in various ways. More recently, I can point to Newton County, Newton County, Georgia, Outagamie County, Wisconsin, Santa Clara County, California, and Hampton County, Massachusetts, which were the 4 sites that we worked with in our last initiative. Their site manuals, which they developed, are available on our website. And what's really fantastic about that is you can walk through both a narrative of how this process unfolded for them, and then take a look at some appendices, some of the products that they developed in terms of agreements, protocols, new releases of information, forms that needed to be developed in order to facilitate the kind of information sharing and collaborative work necessary to move the reform forward. So I think all of those 4 jurisdictions have really demonstrated how to effectively bring together leadership and implement the effective practices that we talked about today. So I would just encourage you to visit the websites and take some time to take a look at those products.
And our last question is, how do we get started and access the support of the RFK National Resource Center?
That's great. So there's a couple of ways. The first is definitely to take a look at the website, as you said. And then the contact information is on that last slide. And we welcome any outreach via email or phone to really discuss what you would like to achieve in your jurisdiction, or if there are questions and information that you need in the day-to-day work that you're doing. We would love to put you in contact with our Dual Status Youth Practice Network. Again, these are on-the-ground professionals who are doing this work day in and day out and have a couple of years at least of experience behind them in these initiatives. So we just encourage you to reach out, and we can discuss happily, any scope of support that we can offer you is exactly what we'd like to do. So we do hope to hear from you.
Great. I want to thank both of our presenters for doing such a great job. As you can see, their contact information is on the PowerPoint slide, and it will be posted, or the PowerPoint will be posted on our website. So if you want to follow up, you can feel free to contact them. And that's all for our webinar. Thank you so much.
Thanks to everyone for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.